Imagine traveling back 30,000 years. There are no cities, no cars, no phones, no headphones. No one around you is scrolling through a screen or talking into a tiny device. You are standing near a small fire, surrounded by a few other humans. One of them suddenly looks toward the darkness and whispers something. Then he answers himself. He is completely alone. At first, it might look strange. Why would someone talk when nobody is listening? But the truth is, this ancient human might have been doing something humans still do today, talking to himself. You probably do it too. Maybe you talk to yourself while cooking. Maybe you argue with yourself while driving. Maybe you say, "Where did I put my keys?" Or you look in the mirror and say, "Come on, you can do this." Sometimes you might even have an entire conversation in your head. And most of the time, you don't even notice it. But why? Why does the human brain constantly create words, even when there is nobody else around? And more importantly, why did this behavior survive for thousands of generations? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. 30,000 years ago, life was completely different. Ancient humans didn't have calendars, notifications, maps, or written instructions telling them what to do. Almost everything had to be remembered. Where was the safest place to sleep? Which plants were safe to eat? Where could water be found? Which animals were dangerous? Where did the group find food yesterday? These weren't small questions. Getting one of them wrong could have serious consequences. And this is where talking to yourself could become useful. Imagine an ancient human preparing to leave camp. He looks at his tools. He checks his food. He looks toward the forest. And he quietly says something like, "Water first." Then he walks toward the river. "Stay near the rocks." He keeps moving. "Don't go too far." To us, this might look like meaningless talking, but his brain is doing something important. It is turning thoughts into words, and words can organize behavior. When you say something out loud, you don't just hear a sound. Your brain has to choose the words, put them in an order, and keep them active for a moment. This can make an idea easier to follow. It's almost like giving instructions to yourself. And ancient humans had plenty of situations where clear instructions mattered. Imagine hunting. You are following an animal through a forest. You need to stay quiet. You need to remember where your group is. You need to watch the animal's direction. You need to avoid making a mistake. Your brain is already processing hundreds of things. So saying something quietly like, "Wait, not yet, follow it," could help keep your attention focused on the task. And modern humans do something remarkably similar. Think about the last time you tried to fix something. Maybe you were assembling furniture. You look at the pieces, you read the instructions, and then you say, "Okay, this goes here." You don't necessarily need another person. You are using language to guide yourself. And ancient humans had plenty of problems that required enormous amounts of mental organization. Finding food, building shelters, making tools, remembering routes, coordinating with other people, understanding seasons, avoiding predators, protecting children, surviving injuries. There were no instruction manuals. Their brains had to create the instructions themselves, and language could help. But there is an even deeper question. If self-talk is so useful, why don't we notice it most of the time? Because the human brain is constantly producing thoughts. You don't have to consciously decide to think in words. It simply happens. You can be walking down the street while thinking about your plans for tomorrow. You can remember something embarrassing from 5 years ago. You can imagine an argument that hasn't happened yet. You can rehearse what you're going to say to someone. And sometimes you don't just imagine the conversation, you actually say the words. This is called overt self-talk. It means the thoughts become audible, and it can happen for many completely normal reasons. Maybe you're trying to remember something. Maybe you're concentrating. Maybe you're frustrated. Maybe you're practicing. Maybe you're entertaining yourself. Or maybe you simply think better when you hear your own voice. But here's where modern life creates an interesting difference. Ancient humans were surrounded by people for much of their daily lives. They lived in small groups. They hunted together, They gathered food together. They protected one another. They shared stories around fires. Today, humans can spend hours completely alone. You can wake up alone, work alone, eat alone, travel alone, and spend an entire evening without having a real conversation. Yet your brain still expects social interaction. So sometimes you become your own conversation partner. You ask yourself questions, you answer them, you react to your own thoughts. You even imagine what another person might say. In a strange way, your brain can simulate a social interaction even when nobody is there. And this ability may have been incredibly useful for our ancestors. Imagine an ancient human preparing for a dangerous journey. He could mentally rehearse what might happen. What if the weather changes? What if the group gets separated? What if an animal attacks? What if food runs out? By imagining different possibilities, the brain could prepare for them. Modern humans do the same thing. Before a job interview, you might imagine the questions. Before a difficult conversation, you might imagine the other person's reaction. Before a competition, you might imagine yourself succeeding. You are essentially running a simulation. And language makes these simulations more detailed. You don't just imagine an event, you can describe it, question yourself, answer yourself, correct yourself, try again. It's almost like having a tiny coach inside your head. But there is a problem. That inner coach isn't always friendly. Sometimes it becomes your biggest critic. You make a mistake, and suddenly your brain says, "Why did I do that? I'm so stupid. I should have known better." You are not talking to another person. You are talking to yourself. And this can reveal something fascinating about the human mind. We don't just experience events, we interpret them. Something happens. Then your brain creates a story about what happened. And that story can influence how you feel. Imagine two ancient humans making the exact same mistake during a hunt. One thinks, "We failed. We're terrible hunters." The other thinks, "We made a mistake. Next time, we'll approach from the other side." The event is the same, but the internal conversation is different. And that difference can influence what happens next. This is one reason self-talk can be powerful. It can turn an experience into a lesson, or it can turn an experience into a threat. Modern psychology has found that the way people talk to themselves can influence attention, motivation, emotions, and behavior. But self-talk isn't always necessary. Sometimes thoughts work perfectly well without words. You can recognize a face without saying its name. You can catch a ball without giving yourself instructions. You can feel fear without describing it. The human mind is much bigger than language, but when a problem becomes complicated, language becomes extremely useful. Have you ever had a problem that felt impossible to understand? Then you started explaining it out loud, and suddenly it became easier. Nothing outside of your brain changed, but your thoughts became organized. You could hear the problem. You could break it into smaller pieces. You could notice contradictions. You could correct yourself. This is why people sometimes talk while solving problems. They aren't necessarily being weird. Their brain is using language as a thinking tool. And this becomes even more interesting when we look at children. Watch a young child trying to solve a difficult problem. They might say things like, "Put this here. No, that's wrong. Try this one. Where does this go?" Adults often stop saying these things out loud, but the process doesn't necessarily disappear. It moves inside. Instead of saying, "Don't touch that," you simply think, "Don't touch that." Instead of saying, "I need to remember my keys," you think, "I need to remember my keys." The voice becomes internal, and this internal voice is something humans use constantly. You can think about your plans. You can remember. You can control your behavior. You can even practice entire conversations before they happen. And sometimes you don't just hear a voice in your head. You actually speak to yourself. This is not necessarily a sign that something is wrong. It can simply be another way your brain organizes information. And perhaps that is why humans have been doing it for so long. Think about an ancient human waking up after a terrible night. He might think, "We're in danger," or "We survived the night." Two sentences, two completely different interpretations, and both could change what he does next. The first might make him more cautious. The second might make him more confident. Modern humans experience the same thing. You fail at something. Your inner voice says, "I can't do this," and you may become less likely to try again. But if the voice says, "I haven't learned this yet," the situation suddenly feels different. The challenge hasn't changed. Your interpretation has. And that is one of the strangest things about self-talk. You are both the speaker and the listener. Your brain creates the message. Then your brain receives it. So when you tell yourself, "You can do this," you're not speaking to nobody. You're speaking to a brain that is listening. So the next time you catch yourself walking around the house saying, "Where did I put that?" don't assume you're being strange. You might simply be using one of the oldest tools your brain has, a tool that existed long before smartphones, long before books, long before cities, long before civilization. 30,000 years ago, an ancient human might have stood beside a fire, looking into the darkness, quietly telling himself what to do next. Today, you might sit alone in your room, staring at a screen, telling yourself the exact same thing. The world has changed. Our technology has changed. Our homes have changed. Our food has changed. Almost everything around us has changed. But inside the human brain, some things are surprisingly ancient. And one of them is that little voice, the one you hear when nobody else is talking. Because sometimes the person you're talking to is you.